Who said that wrote that?
Robert Weston.
Weston,
W-E-S-T-O.
Did you know it was Wesley who started this Methodist church?
No, not Wesley. From
Weston.
Weston.
Not Wesley.
Not Wesley, no. All right. Our chalice lighting is Beacon of Freedom. Rekindle our chalice flame this morning. Awaken the fire of our ancestors in our hearts. Beacon of freedom held out to light the way. Light of reason illuminating the path. Spark of courage igniting our spirits. Aglow with hope for all we endeavor to do together. Holy flame of times past, brighten this present moment, that we may be love that is our center and our foundation, both blessed be. And I missed the prelude. Let's do the prelude, I believe. I believe. Very nice. All right, our opening hymn is 345, With Joy Reclaim the Growing Light. Our affirmation is the prayer of St. Francis by St. Francis of Assisi. This was picked and partially in memoriam to Pope Francis. Lord, make me an instrument of thy peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is sadness, joy. Where there is darkness, light. O Divine One, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, not so much to be understood as to understand, not so much to be loved as to love. For it is in the giving that we receive. It is in the pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying that we are born again to eternal life. Words to live by. All right, our children's story was going to be a little thing on Doubting Thomas, but since we don't have a TV or a connection to the TV, we're going to skip that. And we'll go right to Joys and Concerns. We'll light a candle for Dolly for travel mercies. Hopefully her trip will work out better this time than it did the last time. She is off on around the world or around the Mediterranean, wherever. She's going to be on a long trip for the summer, so she had planned that for last year, and it didn't pan out. The ship actually never left the dock in Ireland, so we'll see how it works out this time. Do we have anything local? Yes.
Asked us to light a candle. I'm not going to use her name because I don't know how she'd feel about things being broadcast with her health condition, but there's a member of the El Dorado Church who's at the significantly elderly end of things who has elected to go into hospice care.
Okay.
So just hold them in the light.
Family and the patient and the person both need support. Hospice is a brave choice, and a choice which we should all be allowed to make. They support you without trying, in a futile sense, trying over and over and over to cure something that cannot be cured. When the disease is progressed to the end, there really is no hope. But there is always hope for a peaceful passing, and that is the point of hospice. They are as much as philosophical and psychological care as they are physical care.
Yeah, and she was just tired of going back to the hospital over and over again.
And that's kind of God's way of telling you
the body's worn out.
Yes, time to go peacefully. And it takes a certain amount of understanding and philosophical and maybe religious, spiritual maturity to come to that point. And hopefully our civilization will allow people that freedom of choice. That's a question for many people. All right. We light a candle, as always, for Israel and Palestine. Things are no better, they're actually worse. Nothing has been, no food, no medicine, no supplies, no clean water has been allowed in for, I think, 6 weeks now. The UN agency has said they've run out of food. They cannot provide rice or bread for the people who are left in Gaza. The Israelis have told them to leave every place they've gone because they say every place they go that Hamas is there. Every time there's a hospital, they say Hamas is in the hospital and they bomb it. Every time an emergency worker in an ambulance drives down the road, they say there's a Hamas operative hiding in the ambulance and they bomb that. They literally are killing people right and left, women and children, first responders, everybody that comes is being eliminated. If that is not apartheid, I'm not sure what the definition should be. So terrible situation, and the world is unable to do anything about it. The next time of crisis, or the next place of crisis, which continues, is the Ukraine. We still have our sunflowers for Ukraine. They've been abandoned more or less by the United States, which has seemed to have taken the side of Russia. Ukraine is being blamed for continuing the war. Ukraine is being blamed for invading Russia, which is laughable on its face. And Russia, supposedly during the time of peace that was arranged, the pause, continued to bomb Ukraine. 10, 12, 13 people. Kyiv was attacked a couple days ago with the worst attack since the beginning of the war. And nothing is being done about it. Our European and international partners are aghast.
Let's light a candle and extend that to hope for those European counterparts who have a sense of diplomacy in the way it should be conducted and are now beginning to emerge as more actively involved in negotiating a peace. They indeed know what they're doing. They have a great stake in it, and they're not willing to abandon Ukraine as the United States has done.
The Baltic states in particular, the states that were under Russian control and have gotten free of that, they know that Russia is not going to stop. And that's part of the peace plan that was supposedly proposed. The United States is offering no guarantees of support, even if Ukraine gives up the occupied territory, even if Ukraine gives up Crimea, which was taken a few years ago. There's no guarantee that Russia won't reconstitute its army and invade again in 2 years and take the rest of Ukraine, and the United States is not promising anything for that. Ukraine, if you remember, when the Soviet Union fell, had the largest stock of nuclear weapons outside of the Soviet Union. They gave all those nuclear weapons up as a promise from the United States to be their defender if anything happened. We have reneged on that promise. The Europeans are aware of this. They know that they are in danger just like everyone else. Once an attacker, once a despot is started on that road, there is no appeasement. There's nothing you can do other than the arms of force, which is where being a pacifist has its limitations. Pope Francis, the conclave is starting. I thought about, which we don't have a TV that works now, or I don't have a thing that works. There is a movie called The Conclave, which is about the picking of a new pope, which I think I'm going to try and watch at home. It's supposed to be a pretty interesting movie, and it is so apropos for the times we live in. Yes?
What did you say the title is?
It's called The Conclave, which is what the Catholic cardinals are now beginning, the conclave, to pick a new pope, to see the white smoke rise over the Vatican. Cardinal or Pope Francis appointed quite a few of the new cardinals, but there is a very strong conservative movement in the Catholic Church, and part of the most active Catholic Church is in Africa, which is the most conservative part of the Catholic Church. They are facing the same split that the Episcopal Church faced. They're more conservative members in South America and Africa, and it's one of the confusing conundrums of a modern life is the people who benefit from liberal thought are the ones who use that liberal thought to advance themselves and then proceed to impose conservative thought on others. I've never really understood that. People who have been helped to freedom then turn around and oppress other people. It's a part of maturity that seems to take a while to take effect, and it seems to take a long while for that culture to permeate the rest of the culture. So anyway, the Catholic Church is facing a decision on who to pick as a new pope. Will it be someone that continues Francis's dictums, his ideas? He said the priests are now allowed to bless same-sex marriages. They don't condone them, and they don't do them in the church, but they are allowed to bless those people. They are allowed to bless people who are divorced, which was previously done. The conservative factions of the Catholic Church do not. They still want to stick to the old-fashioned, original way of the Catholic Church. In some minor sense of schadenfreude, it would not bother me to see the conservatives win, because when the conservatives win, the attraction, the acceptance, the belief in the church goes down. The more conservatives impose their thought processes, the less the population can tolerate that. You can see that in what is happening with birth control in the United States and with abortion in the United States. Some 10 or 20 states now completely outlaw abortion. They are now considering laws to criminalize a woman who has an abortion, can be put in jail for having an abortion. Women, and last year there were actually more abortions performed in the United States than before Roe v. Wade was stopped, because all these women from these conservative states are traveling to liberal states, or the abortion pills are being mailed to them. And they're not getting the prenatal care, they're not getting the care they need to prevent abortions, because the doctors are afraid. There are women actually dying because they cannot get a D&C, a dilatation and curettage, for a premature abortion, miscarriage. And they're saying the woman has to be at death's door before they can do any surgery on the woman, which means some women are actually dying. So, difficult times. I guess I want to raise the question, the Pope's funeral, and the President flew to the Pope's funeral. Did anybody see the pictures of the funeral? What is the considered de rigueur clothing for funerals, particularly for a high-ranking person's funeral? Black suit, white shirt, black tie, black shoes. What was the President of the United States wearing?
Blue.
Electric blue. The only person in the entire thing who had an electric blue suit on. One of the standard protocols for the President of the United States is when flying to an international affair, particularly a funeral, is he invites all the previous presidents to fly with him on Air Force One, so they can provide a united front, the United States standing together with the rest of the world. Did that happen this time?
No.
No. All of the previous presidents had to find their own transportation there. Our current president did not allow anyone else on Air Force One. These are perilous times. You can listen to anybody, but we need to pay attention to what's going on. And we'll revisit that, as I'm sure, as we go along. Any other joys and concerns? All right. One final candle for those joys and concerns that we are not able to mention, maybe we're not even aware of. We as a community of faith are here to support those who need support, and we welcome your support in helping other people. If you feel, as St. Francis of Assisi has said, the greatest gift is to give to others, please join us in giving. All right, Doubting Thomas. Always glad to have Derek here to hear a real sermon.
As always, it is good to return to this pulpit, and a side blessing, especially on a day like this, is the drive up from Richmond. It's beautiful seeing the fields beginning to turn green. There was one field kind of close to the county line, sort of a meadow, where I'm thinking it must have been a few days ago, just like filled from one end to the other with bright yellow dandelions. This morning, all you could see were these silvery seed heads, like everywhere. It was like one big blanket. I hadn't seen anything quite that widespread. Also, thanks to the El Dorado Church for giving me the opportunity to come up here and offer ministry. I will be back on Sunday, May 11th, which is the day after my final day of service to Bethany Theological Seminary. I'll come here, and then I will, from here, go on to my retreat up in Michigan before I begin my new work, May 27th, at Friends Fellowship. The reading appointed for this morning comes from the Gospel of John. But Thomas, who was called the Twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But Thomas said to them, "Unless I see the mark of the nails in his hands, and put my finger in the mark of the nails, and my hand in his side, I am not going to believe." A week later, the disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came in and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." So a few years ago, when I was the pastor of a church that is not the one that I am presently at, a longtime member of our congregation asked to meet with me, and it was the week after Easter, very parallel to the week we are in right now. And I am going to call him Nathan. It's not his real name. But Nathan said to me, "Derek, I'm not sure I can come to Quaker meeting anymore." "Why?" I responded, wondering if somebody had done something rude or hurtful, or maybe he had just come to a different place on the issue of silence in a Quaker meeting and didn't find it useful anymore. His response to me, though, was this: "I don't think that Jesus died and rose from the dead. I think it most likely that he was knocked unconscious from his wounds and the thirst and dehydration, and that Mary Magdalene rescued him from the tomb and got him out of there." I was like, "Nathan, I bet somewhere in this meeting," I told him, "there is at least one person, at least one, who thinks something like you do. I hope you will still come to meeting." But Nathan didn't stay. In his mind, it wasn't right for him to come for any part of Quaker worship, because on this issue, his doubts had led him to answers that he thought were unacceptably heretical. And we were, as a congregation, poorer for his absence. Poorer because of the lack of his perspective. We no longer had that in our midst. Poorer because when he went away, so did his love of service and social justice. That part of his passion went with him. Poorer because, in my mind, he was a unique expression of God in our midst and could not simply be replaced by any number of new people who might come in after him. It's unfortunate that in popular culture, the language of faith has meant that one is supposed to kind of blindly believe in something being true when you do not otherwise know why. In many churches on the Sunday after Easter, stories about the doubting Thomas get told, including the reading that I read to you this morning. And usually the preacher will offer a cautionary tale about how supposedly unfaithful Thomas, he just didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, and he met with the other disciples, and he was just really a naughty saint. In the rush to judgment, there's a great deal that people just breeze right by without looking very carefully. For example, in the story, the other 11 disciples who get lifted up by preachers as the true believers, well, they actually did get to see Jesus. In the story, Thomas just wasn't there. Thomas wasn't there when Jesus previously showed up fresh from the tomb. Was Thomas really any worse of a human being for asking for the same evidence the others took for granted? And that is part of the pitfall of this kind of thinking about faith and doubt. It makes asking for information into a kind of moral failing. And it ignores the moral failing of being negligent in the face of religious claims that maybe aren't true. For example, there are sections in the biblical letters of St. John where John warns about false prophets who arrive in Jesus' name, or who themselves claim to be Jesus, but they're not. So if one is going to warn people
To avoid false prophets, one needs to ask how you know what you claim to know. How do you know what you claim to know? Otherwise, you'll just be inclined to believe any person who comes forward and says that they are the second coming of Jesus Christ. Just take it on my word. Don't doubt. Don't be a doubting Thomas. And our world is littered with the suffering caused by false prophets and false messiahs. Jim Jones, David Koresh, and even people in our current government who love to parrot the name of Jesus, but who by their own lived out actions contradict basic teachings of Jesus because they're reveling in their own wealth. They're advocating for violence. They torment children. They harbor plots for revenge. They pride themselves on their deceptive speech. And every time figures like this have shown up in the world, and people took that leap of faith without thinking, they leapt toward these people by ignoring or suppressing their own doubts, and innocent people have suffered. All that said, let us return to the story, because when Jesus shows up in the upper room, and Thomas is actually there, the first words out of Jesus' mouth are, "Peace be with you." Not, "Get this skeptic out of my sight." No, "Shame on you, Thomas." Or even a very biblical, "Woe be unto those who have even a shadow of a doubt." His initial concern was actually very pastoral, for the well-being of every person there, and the traumas and the fears that people carried in that context, where we cannot be all-knowing. Peace be with you. Peace also be with you. I want to spell something out for you. This is an aha moment for you to take in and appreciate about our own spiritual tradition. Doubt is an attendant of truth. Doubt is an attendant of truth. And the Unitarian minister Robert Weston probably said it best when he wrote these words that began today's service. "A belief which may not be questioned binds us to error, for there is incompleteness and imperfection in every belief." Doubt is the touchstone of truth. It is an acid that eats away the false. Let no one fear for the truth, that doubt could consume it, for doubt is a testing of belief. The truth stands boldly and unafraid. It is not shaken by the testing. For truth, if it be truth, arises from each testing stronger and more secure. Those that with silence doubt are filled with fear. Their houses are built on shifting sand. But those who fear not doubt and know its use are founded upon rock. They shall walk in the light of growing knowledge. The work of their hands shall endure. Therefore, let us not fear doubt, but let us rejoice in its help. It is to be the wise as a staff to the blind. Doubt is the attendant of truth. And so I remind you to cherish your doubts, especially when you can use them to discover truth. be the Thomas whose doubts helped him to find the authentic Jesus among all the impostors that could present themselves to him. The message is not all mine. It is shared with you. This first Sunday after Easter, this Doubting Thomas Sunday, I actually have owned an icon of St. Thomas. I was going to bring it. I thought, nah, I won't bring it because Tim will probably have a fun image of Thomas to put up on the screen.
You have one.
And the technology decided to not obey. But yes, I sometimes have told people Thomas should be the patron saint of Unitarian Universalism. The one who asks the really good questions. Like, you say I saw them put him in the tomb. You say he showed up last week for brunch? Not until I see that myself. What questions do you have this morning? Insights, things you want to share with one another?
What is the connection with the Doubting Thomas, with the book, the Gnostic book of Thomas, the Apocryphal book of Thomas?
So it's attributed to Thomas. So there is a Gnostic gospel. It's actually very complete. There's a bunch of Gnostic gospels that didn't make it into the canonical Bible. Many of them we only have fragments of. Thomas is one of the few that we have like the complete text of. It's very different than the other four canonical Gospels because the Gospel of Thomas contains nothing but sayings attributed to Jesus. So it's just saying after saying after saying after saying after saying, some of which do show up in the other canonical Gospels and some that are unique to that text. Now there are a few things that have more than kind of a whiff of Gnosticism. Gnosticism was not very fond of the human body. It viewed human bodies as kind of corrupt and sinful, and the soul and spirit as pure. And women's bodies were particularly ick. So there are a couple of things in there that New Testament scholars said, I don't think Jesus would have said a saying that basically said, give thanks to God that you weren't born a woman. Doesn't seem to fit with anything else he said in any other record of his teachings. It may have reflected more of a Gnostic concern that bodies, and especially women's bodies, were kind of but otherwise, it's an interesting read, and I do know some UU churches, and I occasionally have pulled something out of Thomas to preach from. But we're not as narrowly bound to canon as some other people. And it is very interesting that there are a bunch of sayings in there that show up in other Gospels. I mean, so somewhere, I don't know, you have all these stories that contradict each other. And, how you get to the truth is an interesting thing. It's like having 5 different...
I was kind of led down basically the rabbit hole, because when I started looking up Thomas for pictures and I found the Gospel of Thomas, one of the references was Thomas was actually the person who went to travel to India and started the Christian church in India. And then the Gospel of Thomas, the one thing I was going to bring you for the children's story, had all kinds of probably the weirdest things on there that were very Eastern asceticism. Mm-hmm. In other words, the body is something that you want to basically it sounded like Hindu or Buddhism or something else. It was more spiritually oriented. Yeah, I don't know about Hinduism. I mean, Buddhism, the body's just kind of a fact. It's there. Do your best with it.
In Gnosticism, the body was seen as unclean, inherently unclean, and it's something to kind of achieve victory over. And you only reach perfection when your soul gets liberated outside of the body. The Thomas thing with India, though, is very interesting because there is a very old Eastern Orthodox community in India called the Martoma. They tend to be along the eastern coast as well of India, so facing the Arabian Sea. And they do claim that they are the result of Thomas coming all the way to India. How much of that's a legend, how much of that is true. But the significantly early existence of this group lends some credibility to it. And I've seen photos of some of their churches. So you'll see like icons or murals depicting biblical stories. And like, for example, the Virgin Mary is dressed in a sari, an Indian sari, but it's blue because that's the color you always put with her with the iconography so you know which person she is. But yes, you see all these biblical figures, but they're presented looking thoroughly Indian. It is a very interesting community. They exist alongside a number of Indian Jewish communities. So there was commerce going on between the ancient Middle East and India. Those Jewish communities are not as large as they used to be. Many of them emigrated to Israel, although, interestingly enough, the long-standing Jewish communities in India never really suffered much in the way of persecution. They were viewed largely as good neighbors who just sort of did their own thing. There weren't enough of them to seem threatening. There is a fascinating book called The Last Jews in Kerala, which tells the story of one of those Jewish communities. They have one synagogue left and barely enough people to convene prayer. And I think at this point, the youngest adult is like a 40-year-old woman. There are no children. So, yeah, the Martoma in India are a fascinating thing as well. Yeah.
Well, I want to share, number one, that my childhood nickname amongst my parents and family elders was Doubting Thomas. Mainly because I was always asking, not why, but more than anything else. As I went on with my learning, I won't say education, I will say learning, as I continued with that, and I'm reading it, and that was the foundation of science that most people seem to forget. Doubt precedes knowing, always. You cannot say you know something if you didn't say, I doubted that existed, or I have a question about why that does what it does. And so it's always been strange to me, and probably one of the major things that I finally broke with standard, my Methodist upbringing and the Catholic background in my family, was the fact that being doubtful, as in Doubting Thomas, was something that was evil. Something you were supposed to go on, and we're still struggling with that in education today. Okay, our education today is basically listen to what I say, sit down, remember it, and get out of my way. And that's basically how it functions, which is, as we all know, I mean, most of us wouldn't be sitting here if what? We hadn't questioned some basic things that we had been taught at one time or another. So doubt is actually, I guess you would call it a kind of institutionalized rebellion.
But it's different. It doesn't even have to be rebellion. It's hard to be curious even without a certain amount of doubt. And I think the interesting thing is people act as if Like, doubt is sort of like the express lane to nihilism. Like, if you doubt, suddenly you'll have no convictions at the end of that process, where actually you can end up in a place where you're much firmer about what you think and what you believe.
Of course.
I wish I could find it again. It was a podcast by this guy who's a somewhat dissenting Mormon bishop. I get the sense he's not well beloved by his colleagues. But he said, like, yeah, I had to doubt and ask a bunch of questions before I came back around and said, actually, this part of it is actually a bit more firm than I thought. And this part is half wrong. But how can you come to that? Like, even with our own Unitarian Universalist tradition, I am probably in a different place than I was 20 years ago. And I couldn't do that if I didn't ask questions.
This whole thing that the Christians, the thoughts that they, and I'm talking about Nicene Christians, these thoughts that they have about Thomas seem to reflect what I think of as bad theology. I think there's a place in the scriptures later on after Jesus says, "Peace be with you," where he says something about blessed are those that believe without getting.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Isn't there something?
Yes, there is. Later in that story.
Yeah.
But he's saying it to a group of people who have all seen him at some point.
Well,
which is the weird irony.
I think there's probably some people though that were associated that weren't the ones that actually saw Jesus that believed it.
Well, and it could also be, because we're dealing, at least in this morning's case, with Gospel of John, which was written a couple hundred years after the life of Jesus.
Yeah.
Some editorial insertion into the story. But I think, there are all sorts of things that we believe are true without having seen them, but we usually have some other reason for thinking they exist. Like, I have never been to Antarctica. Not even once. But I'm pretty sure it exists.
Yeah.
Because people have shown photos and I can see videos. Those could have been faked, like the moon landing, supposedly, but the Earth could be flat. But, in the realm of things, I'm pretty sure it's there.
To me, any image of God doesn't portray God as being perfectly good and perfectly wise is bad theology. And it's human nature to doubt. So if God, either through Scripture or through later on the Christian Church adding to Scripture, if they were portraying God as not understanding that doubt is just part of being human, then that is portraying God as not being wise. And if you're going to not be understanding of people, if you're going to insinuate that people that don't doubt are better than those who do, then that is an image of God that isn't good. So to me, this whole idea of the doubting Thomas after Easter, and I didn't really realize that until one of the things that your sermon and thinking about it brought about was learning that you do this after Easter. I was a minister's son. I didn't even know that.
Typically, so if the church uses the lectionary, which is that 3-year cycle of repeating biblical readings for Sundays, most years on the Sunday after Easter, Thomas shows up in one of the readings. To add to what you're saying, I think I am suspicious that the emphasis on condemning Thomas is not simply a Nicene thing. I think it becomes much more to the fore when you get into the Dark Ages. And you see this emphasis on obedience. And this notion that you are a horrible human being who has disobeyed. And you need to grovel around for a while and beg. Because of your it's an imposing of the medieval social structure. Particularly towards peasants,
That's a good point.
on the entire human family. And what's really interesting is this thing about doubt doesn't even show up uniformly. So you get figures like Meister Eckhart and the Cloud of Unknowing, like this mystical text about like, well, I don't know that, and I don't know that, and I don't know that. And you also, if you're going to stick to like biblical things in the Judeo-Christian tradition, I have never encountered in the Jewish faith the notion that doubt is a sinful thing. If there's anything that goes on among rabbis and in Jewish congregations, it's debate. Healthy, vibrant debate. The kind of debate that in a lot of Christian circles gets sort of finger wagged at as disloyal and, promoting sort of sinful ideas. But Judaism, they're not afraid of a good debate. Nope. Ron.
I just am sitting here thinking, listening to all of this, and really good. It's amazing to me when you stop and think about it. Out of all of the disciples, okay, most of them are ignored. We just, these were people who were supposedly, or were, if you will, followers of Christ in a very intimate way, in a very intimate relationship that they were in, and yet we only hear about two of them when you get right down to it. Peter and Thomas, who are seen to be the antithesis of one another in that. And it's always puzzled me, well, why were all of those other people who were involved in such a major way, ignored?
You do get John's letters. The letters of John, not talking about the Gospels, but the letters of John, kind of sitting alongside Paul's. And like Paul's letters, there's kind of a spectrum of which ones they think are more to less authentic. They're also read a lot less often in churches. John's letters, there's 3 of them. The first, second, and third letters. There's other people who, you'll see their symbol in a Catholic or an Episcopal church, but, do we have stories about them? How many stories about Mark do we get? There's a gospel with his name, sort of taped to it. His name actually doesn't appear in the text itself. The editors taped it to effectively taped his name onto there. Because Luke and Matthew and John were already taken.
I think Mark, some scholars think that Mark was a companion of Peter's and not. There's some scholars that think that Mark was a disciple, and others think that he was a companion of Peter's. And Luke was, I'm trying to remember, he was not.
Luke was a physician. There are a couple of mentions of having been a physician, but Mark is a very cryptic figure. Mark's gospel is also the shortest one. And if I'm remembering it right, it's also the one that the oldest versions of the manuscript do not have a narrative after the tomb? It's either Mark or Matthew. I'd have to look at my notes, which is a very interesting thing to contemplate. Well, I could gab all day long, but I think I'll let Tim finish the service with you.
And that is the reason we are Unitarians. We have doubts and we want to discuss those doubts in the open.
And you can discover wonderful truths to carry with you
Yes.
by sorting through those doubts. It's not an unproductive process.
The great range of information that is available out there that we don't know. As I say, when I started looking for pictures, just to put a picture up of Doubting Thomas, and got into the book of Thomas, and then got into the thing with India, it goes on and on and on. That is the whole point of critical thinking, the whole point of curiosity, the whole point of doubt, is to expand your awareness, to expand your scope of living instead of closing it down, which is what I fear we are experiencing now. Less and less. If you look at what's going on with the legislature, closing down appropriations to libraries, closing down the fact that teachers are not allowed to strike, basically making control of the state over the public tighter and tighter and tighter. Okay, offering. If you have something to share, please do. If you need something, let us know. And we are going to hear April Showers, appropriately enough.
Showers.
is 295. Sing out praises for the journey. Go your ways, knowing not the answers to all things, yet seeking always the answer to one more thing than you know. John Needham. All right, our postlude as time goes by. Does anyone know, was that written for the movie, or was that a tune that they just put in Casablanca? The two are so synonymous now. That's the reason that song is so memorable, is the movie was so
The
memorable.
song was written 11 years before the movie was released.
Maybe that's the reason they made the movie. Somebody heard that song and put the movie together. All right, donuts and coffee are out there. I forgot to mention Cecil. We were trying to get Cecil here. I'm not sure what happened. We'll see if we can figure out. And Dolly's cousin, her name slips my mind. Mary. She wanted to come too, so we need to discuss what the situation is there to see if we can get them to church. Obviously, we need every warm body we can get. All right, I'll try and have the TV. I'll figure out if it's a computer or the TV. I'll see if I can get Emerson to help me, and we'll leave our one candle lit as we always do for those trials and tribulations that we all are experiencing and unfortunately expect to experience in the coming weeks.
Good morning.